It's great to be here. And I've gotten to know a lot about Paulding County in recent years. And I was just chatting beforehand, and I see some friends here today, and it's always great to meet new friends. But I became interested in Paulding County when we had the airport proposal several years ago. And I was always sympathetic with that, and I got to know about Paulding County and its potential for growth and its resources, its people, its politics. And so I've enjoyed, in fact, Robert has been giving me some tutorials recently on what's going on here. So I appreciate the Paulding Business Association. I appreciate the invitation this morning, and I know you have a very good Chamber of Commerce. And I was telling some folks I'd love to do a feature in James Magazine. Journalism is my background. And no fake news, but we'll do a real story on Paulding County and what's going on. In fact, we were just chatting again over coffee. Just yesterday, you had your groundbreaking on Highway 92, and I think I'm right on this. But that widening, the 6 lanes, that is the biggest and first widening we have had, I'm told, in the state of Georgia of a highway since the Olympics, 1996. So I think that's great. It's a great potential. I didn't agree all the time with Governor Barnes's politics, but I always liked the vision of a northern arc. And I think, as you know, I think this is the beginning of what we might call an outer arc with its connection to I-20 and the vision of going over to Cobb Parkway, and then you could get on I-75. So I praise you. I think that's going to be wonderful for this county, and it's going to be wonderful for traffic from all over. So, I thought I would share with you for a few minutes some of the things that were going on in the legislature, but I thought I would lead with that because transportation obviously is a big part of the discussion under the Gold Dome for right up until late March when they're going to adjourn. So. And I think part of this growth we're seeing in construction and infrastructure goes back to a couple years ago during the controversial $1 billion plug tax for the infrastructure. And you're seeing a lot of new projects that have been developed because of that. And whether you were for it or against it, you can see what's going on in Metro Atlanta, and especially with interstates. I was over in Augusta. You see new construction over there, and of course rural Georgia. And that's we could talk a lot about probably transit, which is a component of all of this. And we're going to have a Q&A. I always enjoy the Q&A interaction. Except Robert, you can't ask any. He wants to try to trip me up, so we'll censor him. But I don't know what's going to happen there. I wish I was speaking to you a few weeks later down the road. We'd know a lot more. But there'll be a debate on transit. Now, mass transit is very expensive with heavy rail lines. But you'll hear a lot about, for instance, more widening of the roads, like on 400, more bus lines, more transit links. I'm just going to go down the list just very briefly to just hit some of the things that you might be looking at. Rural Georgia has been ignored. You remember the old phrase, 2 Georgias? Well, unfortunately, there have been 2 Georgias, and the focus this time, and you've got some study committees, is to try to, for example, bring more broadband to rural Georgia. More infrastructure that works. You don't want roads to nowhere like the DOT has done sometimes over the last 20 years. If you're ever down in South Georgia, there's a really nice road and then it just stops and there's nothing there. We can't be doing that anymore. The tax reform. I was just chatting with Daniel when he was in the legislature. He remembers this argument of flattening our taxes. And we had a large majority in both chambers that wanted to continue to flatten our state income tax, but as all too often happens, even though the Republicans control both chambers, the House and the Senate, they never could get together on day 40, the final day, to flatten our income tax. And so that's very frustrating. They also, a large majority of both chambers were for a parental school choice bill where you could have a scholarship account where you take the money that was allocated to you for your public school K through 12, you could transfer that money, and then it could go for private schooling, homeschooling, tutors, things like that. That failed at the last minute because of the give and take of the House and the Senate, and the wheeling and dealing that goes on, and said, well, if you're not supporting my bill, then to heck with you, and you didn't support me, and you get, it often isn't what party is in control, it's often egos and personalities, unfortunately. But I hope that it's an election year, that the good news is maybe the voters are watching more and their constituents are watching more, so maybe more will be getting done. Let's hope so. That kind of lets me, I mentioned that one education component. I think parental choice is the answer here in Georgia and other states, because yes, there's some great public schools, and yes, we should support them. But all too often, if you look at some of these school systems, Governor Deal tried mightily, whether you agreed with him or not, to try to help turn around, as he called it, some of these school systems. And we have not, the dropout rate is still way too high here in this state. And it's a disgrace nationally. And you're throwing in the Atlanta public school system, I think it's 13,000 per student in the Atlanta school system, and I've talked to teachers, you still have kids in the third grade, in not all, but in all too many schools, that can't read or write or even know English in the third grade. And no wonder we're having problems, with our workforce. And so while we all love to get industry coming in, and while we all want good paying jobs for our people, and we are doing great in that area. I think this governor deserves high marks, and his economic team, the Department of Economic Development, for bringing in some great industries, Fortune 500 industries, and diversifying around the state. We still have an education problem, and I'm wondering with this Amazon second headquarters that everybody is excited about, and I understand the governor said the other day that they even want a special session, if that's what it takes, to try to do incentives to try to lure Amazon here. But I just worry that when they look at some of our schools and our K through 12, we have some problems. Now, hopefully that's not going to be a deal killer, but I think it's a factor. Everything else seems to be checked off. I think it's a wonderful testament to this state, the governor, his economic team, the legislature, and businesses, chambers of commerce. Everyone seems to have pulled together. Site Selection magazine, as some of you know, is kind of the Bible of business in this country. And for 5 years running, we have been the best state, #1, in which to do business. So that's something to be proud of, because we want to accentuate the positive, and there are a lot of positives. I'm not going to go down that laundry list, but I will go to an issue that's of concern, obviously, to everybody, and regardless of your politics too, and that's health care. And what's going to happen now, we have to wait and see what's going on in Congress. So, and Daniel, you know this, a lot of times you have to look to see what the feds were doing before you could make some intelligent decisions or take some votes on issues. And I will say this one thing we do have to deal with, whether it's Medicaid expansion or a Medicaid waiver to try to help alleviate the effects of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. We haven't decided, the party leaderships haven't decided yet, but I think keep an eye on the the certificate of need. And this is a thing that's been here in the state, very controversial for about a decade, maybe more, where let's say that I have one hospital right here in Paulding County, and then David Austin, his group, want to do one right down the street. Well, he's got to go hat in hand to the bureaucracy and see if he can actually open it up. And of course, I'm going to be fighting him. And so the con is very restrictive. And I mentioned rural Georgia, where, as we all know, hospitals are closing and they're hurting. I think you might see at least some con reform. Some want to see it repealed and let the free enterprise system just dictate where hospitals and expansions should occur without the government interfering. But I think you might see in rural Georgia perhaps a partial repeal of some of these onerous con requirements by the state. They're working on an adoption bill. I didn't fully realize this until I started researching and reading it and talking to folks. We haven't had our adoption laws changed for over 30 years. They're very archaic. I'm not going to get too much into the specific weeds of the legislation. I think they're working it out, but I think you'll finally see Georgia getting in the 21st century when it comes to adoption and making it and putting more definitions in there. It's amazing some of the bills that are crafted. They're so ambiguous in some areas, and so many times sessions of the legislature just have to tighten up and to tweak laws that, and of course we all know the law of unintended consequences. We always have to see many bills and laws have good intentions, but as the years go by, we see that we have to change or tweak. That gets me to the gun bill. I'm a big Second Amendment proponent, the right to keep and bear arms, and last year was a big controversy over the so-called campus carry gun bill. And what finally happened was a compromise, an expansion of the right to have a firearm by a student who's 21 and who, of course, passes your background check. And when you look at, and this is more for urban universities, this was where the argument was. For example, maybe Georgia State or Georgia Tech or Augusta University, where some of these students had to walk through bad neighborhoods. And as you see in the headlines in downtown Atlanta, these students, I just heard driving over this morning, 2 students robbed right there at gunpoint at Atlantic Station. And while those are fine schools, we just cannot have that. Now, part of that, of course, is a law enforcement problem. But if it was my son or daughter, I would like for them to at least have a handgun in a purse or maybe on his ankle where they could protect themselves. And I don't have a problem. Yes, we could restrict some areas. I think that's an area of negotiation. But I think an expansion of that just for self-protection. And it's interesting, this has been on for a year now. The opponents said, oh, there'll be gunfights and drunken students. There's not been a single incident of a problem. I checked with the Board of Regents anywhere in the 28 public colleges of the state. There's been no problem whatsoever, and I've always said if you can save one life or protect one life, it's worth it. And so I was particularly worried about those kids on urban campuses. So that's my plug. I think you'll see some tweaks in that law where maybe, there's got to be a place to store your gun. If there's a restricted area, you got to be able to put it in there and lock it up, and so no one gets at it. So that's what they're working on right now. One of my pet peeves is that, did you know the United States doesn't have an official language? It doesn't. Now, I know everybody here in this room speaks English, and Georgia is one of 32 states that has a law stipulating English as the official language of government. Now, opponents say it's an English-only law. Well, no, it isn't. That's a misnomer. There are obviously common sense exceptions, but the whole point is to save money and let's face it, we just had the Pledge of Allegiance here a little while ago. I think if you had to name one tie that binds us as Americans, it is I think our language, it unifies us. And I don't care your race or ethnicity or where you're from, but if you're an American and you've assimilated and you're proud of your background, that's great. But we learn English, we learn our basic civics. That's what citizenship is all about. So the reason I say all of this is in Georgia, we have a very weak English and government law. So it's being proposed. Senator David Schaefer is putting in a bill that we have a constitutional amendment stipulating English as the official language of government, again, with common sense exceptions for international business people, the court system, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously with a constitutional amendment, you vote on it, so it would be on a ballot. Amazingly, and it goes to the national conversation, there's pushback on this. And for example, there's a glaring loophole right now in Georgia that this amendment would fix. For a reason I cannot fathom, the Department of Driver Services allows, listen to this, permanent residents of this state, people want to live here and live among us, to take the driver's license test in 14 foreign languages, like Farsi and Chinese and Laotian and all of that. Now that's crazy. It's a threat to public safety, in my opinion, because think about it for a second. All of our signage is in English. And it's passed the Senate a couple times, it's passed the House one time, but it's never been able to really be closing a lot of these loopholes. And I don't know why ask the Department of Driver Services why they do that. Just think of it, if you can't read one way, that's pretty bad. And I've talked to some law enforcement officers. Unfortunately, there's no statistics on this, but you read every now and then of a one-way crash, and it's I don't know if they're legal or illegal, but it's an immigrant that couldn't read. Think about bridge out. That wouldn't be good. Anyhow, you can think of all sorts of scenarios. School zone. So I just thought I would share. So you never read about this in the Atlanta paper. While we're on the topic of immigration, illegal immigration, there is a bill by Representative Jeff Jones down in Brunswick. He has got a revenue producer. Now, I always like new ideas for revenue. As long as they don't raise our taxes, I always like ideas to get revenue. And he wants to slap a fee on wire transfers. And, I've seen this in movies, too, where these criminal gangs, are sending money outside the country from all their illicit activities, or illegal immigrants, are working, and most of them don't pay taxes, and they're remitting all of the money back to their home countries. Well, tack a wire transfer on that and help us. I think Governor Deal said a few years ago that illegal immigration is costing us over $2 billion when you think of the services that are provided. Everything from health care to the schools often that are swamped by illegals. Did you know that we have more illegal immigrants, according to the Department of Homeland Security, than the border state of Arizona? The last I looked on the Pew Research Institute was probably over 300,000 illegals. And cheap labor is not cheap. I think that's the point of all of this. And that is that we have to pay for all of the services that the illegals are doing, let alone the fact that they are taking jobs, and these are good paying jobs. I was at a construction site, just to cite one example, in Buckhead, and I was talking to some African American workers, and they said, Mr. Kent, come on, hey, look at those guys over there, they're illegal, and they're taking our jobs. So the enforcement is not what it should be. And I think you're seeing the national conversation right now is to just exactly how much legal immigration we should have, number one. Should we have chain migration? And what should we do to crack down more on illegal immigration? But, and I have to add a law enforcement component. Cobb County, right next door, the DA, Vic Reynolds there, gave a speech recently where he talked about the gang problem is out of control. And every DA in Metro Atlanta, when I was talking to them about it, said, yeah, it's these gangs, many of them illegal immigrants. MS-13 is a dangerous, violent gang. You read about a taxi driver shot in the head around here. You see that every now and then? You know what that is? That's an initiation. You're to kill somebody to get into the gang. And they're all tattooed, and many of them are illegal. And Vic Reynolds, the DA, rightly, in my opinion, calls it a crisis. I talked to the DA of DeKalb County. This cuts across all politics. Of course, gangs don't follow county lines. They're all over. So in recent years, the state and various DAs have been doing criminal gang prosecutions, and we've toughened it up in the legislature. But I thought I would share that with you, that it's often the spotlight is not on the rising, and it's also in rural Georgia, not just in urban Georgia. Gangs, and of course it's fueled by drugs and arms trafficking and human trafficking. Actually, Atlanta is the worst place in the country for human trafficking. That leads me to the airport. There's actually State Representative John Carson over in Marietta is proposing a state-run airport authority. And all of you have seen the headlines and the stories on television about the just shameful pay-to-play bribery probe, an ongoing federal probe in Atlanta City Hall. And there's going to be some indictments coming, I can tell you that right now. You saw where the chief procurement officer under former Mayor Kasim Reed is now sitting in jail for taking bribes, but he was wearing a wire. And we were talking a little bit before the breakfast started about we wonder who we got talking on his wire, and of course other people were wired. And so this is not over, and they've sent in more FBI agents. There's a new U.S. attorney. In fact, Daniel, you may remember B.J. Pack. I think he may have served in the legislature with you. He's the new U.S. attorney in Atlanta, and he just was quoted the other day as saying, we're going after, these are his words, not mine, more conspirators. So that's kind of a really a sad mark. The whole procurement process needs to be reformed at the airport in the city of Atlanta. And it's the only major city in the country that does not have an airport authority. I think it's just a recipe for corruption if you have a mayor controlling procurement. I mean, we're talking multi-billion-dollar contracts, very lucrative contracts. And corruption's been going on at that airport for over 30 plus years. And nothing ever seems to get done about it. So there may be a study commission this year, is what Representative Carson may do. And there may be more action next year. I don't know if there's going to be an actual bill this year, but it would be, I'm not opposed to a lot of these study commissions, so you at least get information on it. But I did remember, in fact, I chatted with a couple folks here in this room when the airport had that horrible electrical outage just not too long ago. And I was thinking, if Paulding County had a second airport, all those flights could have been diverted, and a lot of that would have been alleviated. So I've always been sympathetic to the second airport. We're I think one of the only major cities in America that doesn't have a second airport. And with all of the things going on, and especially with Paulding County, I think it ought to be looked at again down in the future, down the road. And for all of the economic benefits, I would think, just my opinion, the pros may outweigh the cons down the road. But we leave that to you folks. I think that I've touched on the basics. There was one, I picked up a rumor just this week talking about new revenue sources. They call them destination resorts. What we're talking about is casinos coming in at certain designated areas. And you may remember that was an issue last year, very controversial. Senator Brandon Beach in the Senate had a version. And then Representative Ron Stevens of Savannah, he would love to see something down in Savannah, I think, had his House version. Well, it never went anywhere. And you may see something this year, but probably not in an election year. But the deal was designate geographical areas for a destination resort, and tie, if you get 2 casinos or 3 in the state of Georgia, wherever they are, tie that to the lottery and the Hope Scholarship. Because, and all of you I think have seen this, Hope is obviously very successful, very popular, tied to the lottery. I mean, I think, what was it, over $1 billion since Zell Miller instituted it, and in 1993 have gone to scholarships and then later to pre-K programs. I'm amazed that other states in the union have not copied the Hope Scholarship. But the Hope Scholarship needs more revenue. And we've had to pull back in recent years. And so the proponents say that this is a good way to if you could tie this revenue into Hope, that would help shore up the system. Now, I'm a big believer in people voting on things. And if you're going to do that, of course, it would be a constitutional amendment that would be on a ballot. And then they would have to, if the people approve that statewide, then there's an extra layer. Let's say if it came to Paulding County or Chatham County or Richmond County or Fulton County, the people of that county or that city, that entity, would still have to vote on it. So the people would have to be comfortable in approving a destination resort or a casino. So that's kind of what they're talking about. You may see it maybe come up more next year rather than this year, because a lot of the politicians perhaps don't want to get into that in their particular districts for this election year. feel free to contact me. My email is on the masthead of the magazine. And as I say, I want to get a plug in for Paulding County. We'll have to do a feature down the road on the county. Right, Robert? You're going to help me on that?
Yeah, we're going to do that.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed it. I'm going to hang around for a few minutes, so thank you so much. Appreciate it.